So while Tim is doing this, let me ask you, how many of you are here because you are presently or have at some point cared for somebody with dementia? Yeah, so it's sort of good news that the room is so full, but it's also kind of bad news to some extent, because we're dealing with an illness that's increasingly common in our culture. It's actually, Alzheimer's is one of a number of types of dementia, of course, and all of these illnesses are becoming more prevalent because we're aging as a civilization. I often describe the baby boom generation as an egg in the belly of a snake going through time. So now we're aging, and along with it, the diseases that are often common to us as we age are becoming much more frequent. So, but I am really glad to be here. I retired a year ago from the Alzheimer's Association. I was there for more than 13 years. And I didn't know I would have an opportunity in the future to talk again about Alzheimer's, but I can't think of a better group to sort of rekindle my interest and to share these thoughts with you. The nice thing is that for you, this is sort of my opportunity to bridge my Catholic Christian faith with what I learned about Alzheimer's, and actually also to tell you that while I was working in the association, I did a lot of presentations for many years, and I often found it astonishing how I was able to recognize or see or integrate Christian Catholic virtue in presentations about caring for people with dementia. And that's what I hope to accomplish today, is to show you these associations. It's remarkable that our faith really gives us a foundation for caring for people who are struggling with serious illnesses, and particularly dementia. And I hope to make that case for you today. I am going to also show you a little bit of what's going on with research. It's very, very interesting. And so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of statistics, but I do want you to kind of know what's going on. I do intend to be brief because I think the most interesting part of the morning will be an opportunity for us to have a conversation. So I'm going to try to go through my slides rather rapidly and then just allow you to ask questions or to make comments and observations. I will say also by way of introduction that I think Alzheimer's or various forms of dementia, these are the diseases of the modern era. I'm convinced of it. And it's, as families are declining, as there's less actual human contact between individuals, as we become more technological, we're also reducing our capacity to build active, healthy brains. And I'm convinced, and also we're not as physically active as we used to be, so our bodies are more sedate, which is a contributor to the onset of dementia late in life. And so I think we're living in an age when we have the potential to reduce risk, reduce the numbers of people with dementia, but it will require lifestyle changes. And that's one of the places where I argue that our faith and our life as followers of Christ really compels us to live in a way that not only brings joy and love and hope and faith to the world around us, but also really reduces our risk of dementia. Now, I say reduce risk rather than prevent, because obviously, you know, St. Albert probably had some form of dementia, obviously a very devout Christian. We all, of course, are aware of St. John Paul II had Parkinson's, fortunately never got any form of dementia as a result of his Parkinson's, but nobody would ever argue that he wasn't a devout Christian. So sometimes these diseases just happen to us no matter how devout we are. Father Logan, of course, suffered with illnesses and ultimately succumbed and died from them. So I can't say that being a virtuous Christian prevents age-related diseases, but I can say fairly confidently that a virtuous Christian life reduces risk. And that's the argument I want to make here today. So thankfully, Tim told you that I'm a G.K. Chesterton devotee. I think I pulled up we've got two versions on here. This one is the PowerPoint version, which hides the quote a little bit, but I'll just read it to you. By experts in poverty, I do not mean sociologists, but poor men. That's classic Chesterton wisdom. It has been often said very truly that religion is the thing that makes the ordinary man feel extraordinary. It is an equally important truth that religion is the thing that makes the extraordinary man feel ordinary. That kind of wisdom was the basis of the way I oriented myself to my work as a practitioner with Alzheimer's. I believed the entire time I was with the association, I continue to believe that the real experts in the field of dementia are who? The people with dementia, absolutely right. If you want to understand dementia, talk to the people who have it. And also, the other thing that interests me is that it's fascinating to me that there really are no expert Christians per se, right? We are, to greater and lesser degrees, attached to Christ and to one another by this common faith that we share. But that's a whole different way of thinking about relationships and thinking about what being a Christian means, rather than saying, well, this person's on this level of the hierarchy of Christianity, and this person is here, and this person is there. And the way of looking at Christianity that way also oriented me to how to think about dementia. There are no experts other than the people who are living with it, and that opens the door for us to create relationships that are helpful. All right, so I'm going to go through a series of dot points here that talk about my perspective on how Catholic Christianity and dementia care, where they intersect. And the first thing, of course, is the idea that we believe, as Catholic Christians, in the sanctity of human life, that we are given something very unique and very special when we're born. We're imprinted with an indelible soul that is with us regardless of what happens to us in life, right? And it doesn't matter how ill or how debilitated we become, that piece of us is never lost. And that's what I mean by the title, that all is not lost. I might say the most important part of being a human is not lost. And the reason that's important is because if you look at the history of caring for people, the recent history of caring for people with dementia, going back 100 to 150 years or so, what you'll see is that years ago, when we discovered that somebody had dementia, we would put them in a dark institution and basically tell the families to stay away because now the person is gone. This is not your mother anymore. This is not your dad. This is not your grandfather. We'll be happy to feed and shelter this person who used to be your parent or your grandparent, but now you go off and live your life. That sounds sort of extreme, but that's really the kind of messages we used to give people. And the reason we gave people that message, I believe, is because we lost the ability to recognize that just because somebody's brain is broken by an illness doesn't mean that they've lost the most essential part of them, which is their soul. And not only that, but their ability to give and receive affection, to be in meaningful relationships, to be happy. And there's tremendous benefits to all of us that are still available to people with dementia. The essential need to be connected, as St. Augustine famously says at the beginning of his Confessions, that the heart is restless, our hearts are restless until they find rest in God. It's not the exact quote, but I know you've all heard that quote. And it is true that we are living in a fallen world, and we are hungry for our home, right? We want to go home. We want to find where we really belong. C.S. Lewis described this as the Shadowlands. It's not really where we belong. We're living on this earth waiting for full completion of who we really are. And it's the connection between where we live now and where we're destined is this soul, this indelible stamp that's been placed in us. And it makes us restless because we know we don't really belong here. Well, how many of you are aware of how often people with Alzheimer's who, when they're living someplace they're not familiar with, say, I want to go home? And they repeat that expression over and over and over again. Well, you know, there's practical reasons why people say that. They might be unfamiliar with where they're living. Maybe the people around them aren't treating them very well. They feel insecure and lost. They don't recognize the things that are around them. But I believe there's a more fundamental reason, I've always believed this, that they're reacting to that same restless impulse that affects all of us. We're looking for something that none of us ever finds. So when a person with Alzheimer's says, I want to go home, what I say is, I do too. So let's go together. Let's figure out how to get there. Instead of saying, well, Mom, you're living in a care facility now. We had to sell your house. You're not able to take care of yourself. To kind of use these rational reasoning techniques to get people to understand where they are and why they're there is an inappropriate way, really. Well, it doesn't fully grasp the importance of what's going on in that moment, in my humble estimation. Another observation I made in my years with the association is this idea about original sin, our fall from grace from the Garden of Eden. And I believe there's a direct link between that and this idea that we always like to be right. We always like to be on top. We like to be correct. We like to be the one with the right answer. So if my dad, who has Alzheimer's, says, wow, that was a great hamburger you made last night, son. My temptation is to say, well, no, Dad, we had spaghetti. It wasn't a hamburger. I don't know why you know what I mean? And the truth is that it makes us feel good to be right. It really does. And even if my dad didn't have dementia, if he forgot, I'd be very happy to tell him that he was wrong. Well, that to me it comes out of our fallen nature. That's the brokenness of our souls. That we fail to know how to lift up the others around us, even at our own expense. We would rather lift ourselves up at the expense of another. In fact, Deacon Joe and I, with our small men's group, we were just talking about that phenomenon earlier this morning. Deacon had an observation at a retreat. Another place where Catholic Christianity and dementia care intersect is this idea of who God chooses. Moses was a stutterer, right? David was the runt of the litter. Peter was a hard-headed coward. Paul was an arrogant, over-self-confident zealot. And these are the people that God chose to revolutionize the world. So why shouldn't God choose a person with dementia to set us straight? See, that's the point. We think our job in caring for people with dementia is to get them back into reality. Well, maybe their job is to get us back into love. And that we've got it backwards. I have always tried to help caregivers understand that this is not just an energetic, overburdened process of you caring for this person who's declining. It's also an opportunity for you to learn from them about yourself and about life itself. People with illnesses give us great gifts. We have to look for them, we have to be willing to find them, and have to be willing to be humble enough to accept them. But I think one of the insights is that that's the way God has always made it. He didn't, in fact, Jesus is in conflict for his whole time on earth. He's in conflict with the religious leaders, the experts, the religious professionals, the ones who had more knowledge than the rest of the people. Jesus didn't go to them and say, be my disciple. Ultimately, he invites all of us, of course, but he chose fishermen and tax collectors and people that the rest of us would think are unworthy. So that appeared as a link to me. Why not allow people with dementia to be our teachers? And of course, another way that dementia care and Catholic Christianity intersect is sacrificial love. This creates very difficult tension. And those of you who survived being caregivers for a number of years understand this, that there's a real need for caregivers to take care of themselves. But I always try to tell people about the difference between virtuous self-care and selfish self-care. And there is a difference. If I'm caring for my wife because I love her, and if I'm taking care of myself because I need to be healthy in order to care for her, that's virtuous self-care. But if I'm taking care of myself because I'm thinking more and caring more for myself than I am for the person I love, that's selfish self-care. So it's not that self-care is wrong or bad, it's that it depends on how it's motivated. What motivates us to care for ourselves matters. And that's a very Christ-like principle, isn't it? The last shall be first. Those who lose their lives shall gain their lives. And the Scripture is replete with these images, of this paradoxical image of the more I give, the more I receive. And I can't imagine another arena more fruitful than the living room of a house where a man and a woman, one with dementia and one without, are interacting, where that principle comes alive. Right, Andy? Absolutely. So it's, again, people with dementia give us tremendous opportunities, and particularly when it comes to cultivating that capacity to be sacrificially loving. The preeminence of the heart, I'm going to say more about this in a minute because I think it's very key. But it's interesting that that God really seems to have kind of a bias for the heart as the seat of our humanity. I was telling Donna, my wife who's here today, I was telling her yesterday, we were talking about this presentation, and I was saying, I just had this thought that the heart is to the human being what the tabernacle is to the church. And that's right, isn't it? Because we say, Jesus, come into my heart. Jesus, be on the throne of my life. We're typically thinking of our heart. Now, we invite Jesus to help us to reason well and to think well, but ultimately, the place where we hope that Jesus will reside is in our hearts. And there's all kinds of scriptures that bring this idea to light. In 1 Samuel, of course, when Samuel is looking for the king of Israel and he goes to Jesse, who is the father of 7 sons, and ultimately finds David, as I mentioned earlier, the runt of the litter. Scripture says, God does not see as a mortal who sees the appearance. The Lord looks into the heart. So what Samuel wasn't recognizing was that all these very strong, capable brothers of David, who looked like they would be the right king, not to God, not in God's eyes. God was looking at David because he saw something in his heart. And when you read Psalm 51, the repentance psalm, you recognize that deep longing and desire within David to be faithful to his Lord. And there are numerous other verses throughout Scripture. Find your delight in the Lord, who will give you your heart's desire. Who may go up to the mountain of the Lord? Who can stand in his holy place? The clean of hand and the pure of heart. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those whose spirit is crushed. And Scripture goes on talking about this idea about the human heart. Now, the reason that's important is, and I'll talk more about this momentarily, is that the very fascinating thing to me about dementia, Alzheimer's, and related diseases is that it's the brain that breaks, not the heart. It's very interesting that somebody may not remember a conversation, but they're going to remember how they felt in that conversation. That emotional memory stays with people long after the substance of that conversation is lost. So that's a great way to engage in a relationship with somebody with dementia, is to realize that, okay, the brain, I can't rely on that anymore as a tool for communication, but I can certainly rely on my heart and on this person's heart, because they're still intact. That's the part that's not lost. Research is a quest for answers motivated by love. I think it's very important, I'm sort of speaking this to the medical research community, that research motivated by virtue ultimately brings us to truth and ultimately brings us to answers. But unfortunately, those of you who are researchers recognize that sometimes we're motivated by the grant we're going to get, by the recognition we're going to get from the insight that we gain, so forth. We're motivated by false reasons. And my argument always, as a practitioner in the Alzheimer's Association, is that if we're going to raise money for Alzheimer's, then we need to be devoted to the truth. We need to be devoted to the virtue of what these relationships, the virtues that are possible in these relationships. And it's a beautiful thing to me that the Catholic Church has always been a proponent of science when it's done for the right reasons and when it really is motivated by virtue. Humility, truth, perseverance. This is what research is about. Otherwise, we sort of slip into a scientism where we believe that materialism is the only reality and that spirit and soul don't exist. So another place where Catholicism and dementia care intersect. And finally, Jesus says in Matthew 6, I believe it is, at the end of Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, right after Jesus gets done telling people to love their enemies, he says, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." And you're like, yeah, how am I going to do that? How is that possible, to be perfect? And Jesus tells us, just before that, he says, you want to be perfect, love your enemies. And by that, what he's saying is he's expanding the circle as far as it can go. He's not saying forget your family and love your enemies. He's saying not only the person next to you, not only the person who lives next door to you, not only the people in your neighborhood, not only the people in your community, not only the people in your church, not only the people in your country and in the world, but even the people you battle with, that you fight. Everybody matters. And that's what, and if we can achieve that, then we have attained the kind of perfection I believe that Jesus is talking about. Now, the reason this is important in dementia care is because those of you who have cared for or who are caring for people with dementia quickly understand that sometimes the person with the disease becomes like your enemy. It's very, very difficult to love the person who's fighting you, resisting you, won't go to the doctor when you know that person needs to go to the doctor, won't eat breakfast, won't get in the shower, won't change their clothes, is going to argue with you about everything you bring up. That person is no longer just the person you've been married to. Now this person becomes your enemy. And it's a very, very sad thing. And fortunately, Jesus gives us the grace, I believe, and the courage and the strength to find the path that allows us to love this person despite those battles. Okay, I'm going to move on sort of quickly here because I do want to leave a lot of time for your questions and our conversation. So it became important for me to understand what Alzheimer's is, what dementia is. Well, in simple terms, dementia is disconnection. What happens with Alzheimer's is, if you don't know this, there's a buildup of a fragment of a protein called beta amyloid that coagulates with other little fragments of beta amyloid. It creates these little microscopic deposits, and very, very interestingly, those little deposits don't just float around in empty brain space. They actually get in the middle of two cells that are designed to communicate with each other. So it's a sinister illness because it causes a breakdown in cellular communication. That's really what Alzheimer's is. It's the breakdown of the ability of cells to talk to each other. And also, the other hallmark feature biologically of Alzheimer's is that some cells get tangled up, they break down on the inside, also because of a corrosive process inside the cells themselves. But again, what happens is when the cell breaks down on the inside, it loses its ability to communicate with neighboring cells. And that's how our bodies function. Our bodies are an amazing network of intercellular communication, cells talking to one another, telling them what to do. Well, Alzheimer's breaks down that communication. In other words, it disconnects our cells one from another. And interestingly, that's what happens at the macro level as well. Once the brain breaks down, we begin to lose our ability to stay connected to our own memories, connected to ourselves, connected to the people around us, connected to our neighbors and friends, connected to our churches. Alzheimer's is a disease of disconnection. I was telling you that I want to tell you more about the preeminence. Can you see this, Bob? All right, okay. The preeminence of the heart. I'd rather have a broken brain than a broken heart. And what I mean by that, well, I'm trying to make the case that really there is a hierarchy of importance about the human experience, and that the heart actually is, in my opinion, more important than the brain. Now, the brain comes in handy, don't get me wrong. It's nice to be able to reason and think and, calculate and so forth. But ultimately, wouldn't you rather be less intelligent and more caring? That, you know what I mean? You see, and I used to, when I gave presentations for people who work in care facilities, it's usually young women, I would ask them this question: how many of you would rather be in a relationship with a guy who is very brilliant, but he's not very kind to you, versus a guy who's only gone through 8th grade, but he's very warm and loving and he treats you like a queen? And only one time did somebody say, which one of them has the most money? So, but really, they got the point, right? Wouldn't you rather be in a relationship with somebody who is less educated but more caring than somebody who's less caring and more educated? I think the point is that we are naturally drawn to people because they care, not for what they know, but for how they treat us. And that's critical with people in caring for people with dementia. The old expression, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You could be very, very brilliant, but it's worthless if you're a cold, calculating person. People don't care what you know. They want to know how you care. The heart remembers what the head forgets. There's all kinds of interesting research about this, by the way. That, as I mentioned earlier, people with dementia will forget events and conversations. They'll forget details, but they won't forget how they feel and experiences. And ultimately, that's why oftentimes people they'll get in long battles with people because they may not be remembering conversations, but they're remembering how they felt in that relationship. They're associating an emotional reaction with a person who has not been very kind to them. So the antidote, of course, obviously, is, to the extent that this is possible, is to create a loving, safe, joyful environment anytime you're in the presence of somebody with dementia. And then they're going to be happy when you walk in the room, regardless of what your conversation was about 3 hours ago. Compassion trumps correctness. Why Trivial Pursuit is popular. Anybody want to take a stab at why that's true? Why is Trivial Pursuit such a popular game? It's a very simple answer.
Because it's remember things from your past.
You remembering things from your past? That's one benefit. I think there's even a more important reason why we like to play it.
We want to show them how smart we are.
We like to show people how smart we are. It's because we like to be right, especially when other people are wrong. Now that gets us in trouble with people with dementia. It really does, because we're always correcting the person because quite often they're not correct, they're not right. So it's an impulse in us as human beings that we have to find a way to govern, or we make the relationships much more difficult. I used to tell people in the industry that we're not paid to be right, we're paid to be good. In fact, Deacon Joe said something almost exactly like that this morning in our men's group. Yeah, it's true. You know, I would rather you be incorrect and care for me than I would that you be uncaring and correct. Okay, a little bit more about Be Perfect. You know, isn't that a great picture? So, you know, just a note about, I did work in a number of nursing homes, and I actually developed this attitude that sometimes the most difficult people were probably the healthiest, because they were still saying, I have the right to say no. And again, it goes back to this idea that we who are the professionals, whether it's a spouse in a relationship, we who have the ability to dominate have to be very careful not to communicate our dominance, whether we're either paid or unpaid caregivers. And because we run into these resistances. The reason we often told people that the reason people sort of get frustrated and irritable, aggressive, and so forth, people with dementia, is not because the disease is pushing on an aggression button in the brain. It's almost always something that's triggered that aggression, that irritability. And I hate to say this, but 9 times out of 10, it's us. We've created the irritability by how we've communicated, by the environment we've set up or not set up. And it's a huge burden to care for somebody with dementia. I don't mean to minimize that to any extent. But the truth is that when people are irritable, it's almost always because something has triggered that irritability. So our job as professional or unpaid caregivers is try to locate that trigger, locate that source, and remove it, and create a more joyful, loving, patient environment. And I mentioned a little bit about emotional memory already. So Dr. David Snowden, many years ago, started this study of Roman Catholic nuns in Kentucky. He's expanded it. Shortly after that, he's now studying religious for 30 years, I believe. And he's one of the first people to recognize that there's a difference between the biology of Alzheimer's and the symptoms of Alzheimer's. And what he means is, what happened was, he got a bunch of almost all the religious people he asked to participate in his study agree to do it. And he asked them to donate their brains when they died, and what he recognized was that some people had massive amounts of the biology, the plaques and the tangles in their brains, but they weren't showing symptoms. So he was the first person to suggest that there's other variables that can interfere with the actual manifestation of the disease. It's very, very interesting. He coined the expression that Alzheimer's begins in childhood. And what he meant, and I'm going to show you something here in a second, what he meant is that Alzheimer's related diseases really have a lot to do with how we live, which has a lot to do with how we raise our children, which has a lot to do with families staying together and churches staying together and communities staying together, with us staying connected. These Catholic lifestyle virtues are critical not only for the well-being of our soul, but for the well-being of our body. There's absolutely no doubt about it now. The research is overwhelming. So I want to show you a couple of, first of all, a lot of information. I'm just going to sort of explain this to you. The cognitive continuum. Many of us in this room will relate to this one. Normal aging. We're thinking effectively, but we're noticing that we're forgetting names a little more frequently, forgetting an appointment every now and then, and it's just normal aging. So we're going to start there. I'm not going to go all the way back to childhood, but it is true that just as our bodies lose capacity as we age, so do our brains. But then, it might be true that some of us actually have some genetic risk factors in our body or other potential biological factors that increase our risk. So we might call that preclinical or pre-symptomatic. So you've got a higher likelihood of ending up with dementia because you have these factors in your body, but you're not showing any symptoms. You're pre-symptomatic with a disposition. And then there is the state called mild cognitive impairment, which is like your forgetfulness and other cognitive decline is measurable, but it's not impeding your life in any practical sense. You're still able to move around and flow, live your life well, but if you were to take cognitive tests, it would show up that you've got some kind of a cognitive impediment in your brain. And then finally, the final stage is dementia. So what we've learned is that the decline in cognition is actually a long continuum. And this whole process from normal aging to dementia might be 15 or 20 years. So here's the really bad news. It's very likely that some of us in this room are on that continuum, but I do have some good news for you. So this is another way of kind of looking at the same thing. This is the series of stuff that happens to the brain of a person who ultimately ends up with dementia. So you've got normal aging, preclinical, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. That's like a 15 or 20 year time span. But look at this. This is very interesting. Okay, is this okay? All right. So this is the buildup of the plaque. This is the synaptic dysfunction. In other words, the linkages between brain cells are breaking down. This is the buildup of the tangles that are inside the cells. This is where your brain begins to lose structure and size. Your brain volume shrinks. Then finally, you start to show cognitive decline and actual clinical functioning decline. These are the people who are now dependent on others to care for them. But notice how much happens long before you're even showing any signs of dementia. In other words, dementia doesn't just turn on and suddenly you're demented. It's a long, slow process. So the point is, with research, where research is going is we're trying to figure out how to manage the disease without, well, we ultimately want to cure it, but in the meantime, let's figure out how to manage it first. And that means intervening there. in normal aging, in preclinical stages, if we can provide interventions in those phases, we may be able to delay this cognitive decline for many years and might even be able to prevent it. So how do we do that? Well, there are a lot of ways that people suggest. You might be familiar with Dr. Fortnace. He and Father Roger Landry did a series called Remembering Jesus on EWTN a number of years ago. And he developed this model called the DEAR model, diet, exercise, accentuating your brain, rest and recovery. Sleeping, eating, exercising, normal, healthy human activities appears to really have a major impact on reducing risk. It's just common sense, right? Well, in Dr. Fortnace, I put him up here in particular because he's a devout Catholic and because of this series that was on EWTN. But there are many, many doctors who are making the same argument. So for those of you who might have, by the way, if Alzheimer's or forms of dementia are in your family background, you may and very likely have some genetic disposition. So if that's true for you, or if you're starting to notice that I'm 66, if you're starting to notice at my age that you're starting to not remember as well, the best thing you can do for yourself is to improve your diet if it's not good already, exercise, do things to activate your brain, sleep well, common sense things. You have to wonder about a number of other things that are going on in the world right now. Technology. It's a wonderful story. My friend Scott Schroeder told me this story. He read in a men's magazine about this guy who had gone to Iceland on a vacation. He had a Garmin or some type of GPS locator. He was going to try to find this famous place. And he also had maps in the car. And this is a key piece of information. Well, the GPS locator did not get him where he was going, and he literally drove for 7 or 8 hours and finally decided if he had just looked at the map when he got started, he could have been at this place in an hour or whatever. I don't remember the details specifically, but it just dawned on him that he was so dedicated and so addicted to this technology, he continued to trust it even though he knew his brain was probably more capable of getting him where he was going. In other words, he had crossed the line with trusting the technology over his brain. And in this case, the brain would have been a more effective tool. So you have to wonder how much of that is going on in our civilization. How much of our brain power are we giving over to our technological devices? There's a decline in family life. That's not news to anybody. Dr. Snowden, when he was beginning his research, talked to child educators and early development child specialists and said, what's the one most important thing you think that parents could or should do with their children in terms of reducing risk of dementia later in life? And they all said, read to your children. Get your children interested in reading. You're spending time with them. You're getting their brains activated. You're creating a good habit. I mean, there's many other things that you can do. So you have to wonder if the decline in family, if stressed out mothers aren't spending enough time with their children, and fathers who are working 2 jobs, if they're even in the home at all, are not spending time with their children. These are, not only there's this vital Catholic Christian theology, it's also really important, it turns out, for preventing late life illnesses. There's a very interesting study that came out about 3 or 4 years ago by a researcher at Duke University. I think she's from Denmark or something. She discovered that the hippocampuses, you've got one on each side of your brain, which is, by the way, where Alzheimer's typically starts. People who don't get enough silence in their lives have smaller hippocampuses, or hippocampi. I don't know how you say plural. But so she's speculating that there may be a relationship between too much noise and an undeveloped brain in a particular region where dementia usually begins. Very fascinating. And there are other studies that are confirming her findings. So we don't get enough silence. So maybe we all need to spend more time in retreat, right? Maybe the church is right for a number of reasons in that respect. The Christchurch mutation, you might have just seen this in the news within the last week or so. that Christchurch is a city in New Zealand where doctors discovered this particular mutation. It's a woman in Colombia who has, her brain is just riddled with the biology of Alzheimer's, but she's not showing any symptoms. Turns out it's because she's got this particular mutation. I just found it fascinating that it was Christchurch in New Zealand where this discovery was made. It seems like providence to me. Donna introduced me or brought to my attention recently a study that we had collected years ago about people who are conscientious, goal-driven people. It appears to be that it reduces the risk of dementia later in life. And then I often wonder about gratitude. What does gratitude do to us spiritually and physically? So I want to end with this, and I often would show this photograph to people when I was talking to them about dementia care. I would tell them that this is the exact same photograph. And I would argue, by the way, you know, we as Catholics spend a lot of time talking about, you know, we need to rid the world of abortion. We need to build up family life. We need to improve the relationships between fathers and their children, between mothers and fathers together in relationships. We sort of focus on the young family. But I think it's imperative that we remember the family remains a family when mom and dad are 85 years old. And that the care that's needed for older people is as vital as the care that's needed for younger. So I argue that these are the same pictures. They're the same because what matters is the connection between these individuals. This mother and her baby, this father and his son. They're bonded, they're close, and their love is evident. And ultimately, we as Catholic Christians, I believe, can minimize for ourselves the risk of getting dementia and also create a world in which people who have dementia can still be happy and live fulfilled lives. So that's all I wanted to say, and I probably went a little longer than I intended to, which is usual for me. But so I know we have some time for questions and responses. It shows, and it was really funny when I would tell people in an audience this because everybody would laugh. Apparently, women who have multiple children have reduced risk of dementia later in life, the study shows. And the hypothesis is that what happens is when you've got a child in your body develops protective factors. And the protective factors protect you as well as the child. And if you have multiple children, there appears to be a sustained benefit to those protective factors. So, you mean it's hypothetical, but I mean the correlation between multiple births and reduced risk appears to be pretty sound. But the reasons why that's true is still uncertain to us. But so when I would tell that to people, you know, all the women, of course, would start laughing. And
did they define multiple?
Well, yeah.
But it looks, that's a relative term.
Well, it is a relative term, and it might be for some women's bodies, maybe 2 or 3 children is enough to build up those protective factors. Maybe for others it's 5 or 6 or whatever. They're just saying that when they looked at women who gave birth to 1 or 2 children, the benefit was much more modest than for those who had more than that. Yeah.